My goal is to try and get this video done before I get back to my place, but I was just at my local whiskey shop talking to the owner and, really discussing the U.S. tariffs with regards to Scotch whiskey. Well, really, all UK whiskey. I thought, maybe it would be good to provide some insight into what that looks like for us in the U.S. and what I believe the implications are going to be. Something I haven't figured out, I'm not certain of, is the Scotch whiskey industry going to pass all of that burden onto the consumers? And I think this is an important question for us to ask, because what we know today is very little in terms of margins and cost and burden rates for the Scotch whiskey industry. I think we can all safely say that that there is the disadvantage with whiskey production, that there's a very low return on currency. In the buying market, you talk about net payment terms and how soon do you get your money after you produce your product. Well, in Scotch whiskey, instead of you're talking 60 days, you're talking 900 days minimum, right? Between the time you incur the cost of production and the time that you see potential revenue return. So there is a burden that exists with the Scotch whiskey industry, and I think it's important for us to recognize that. However, the Scotch whiskey industry has also been taking actions to try and reduce costs, and we know this because the whole non-age statement trend is directly as a result of less stock of older whiskeys, which naturally means that whiskeys are aging less time. And now you could argue that, but maybe they're supplementing that with something else. And to that I would say, if they were, we've all tried very young whiskeys that do very well. I think, Kilchoman Macrame, when it first came out, was a great example of a whiskey that was 3, 4, and 5 years old, but really rocked our socks off. That's not what we're seeing nowadays in the Scotch whiskey industry, and it's kind of an interesting point. So anyway, we assume that margins are getting better. Now, what happens when you introduce a tariff to that product? Well, one, we have to ask, how big is that market for production? And we can say, although we are maybe not the largest market, we are certainly up there. And I don't remember. I know that Japan really likes their single malts. Taiwan really likes their single malts. But again, how big of a country is that? The U.S. likes their single malts. So, and of course around the EU as well, there's plenty of that demand out there. But we are a big customer as a country for the importation of single malt whiskey, or rather whiskey in general, because it's not exclusively single malt. And this presents some challenges. So naturally, it is only a given that when you slap 25% onto the cost of importation, we're going to see that reflected or more in our price. If they were to pass through that cost directly to the consumer base, that will decrease the purchasing of whiskeys irrefutably. And so I think what we're going to see, my opinion is, we're going to see them absorb a fraction of this. This is kind of like with steel producers when they leaded steel producers from the European region, when they had to take on that burden, they took part of it on themselves to maintain a market share of not just the leaded steel product, but non-leaded steel product as well, realizing that if they could grit and bear it in the short term, that they would keep that market in the long term. So maybe not all of your whiskey producers will do that, but some of them will. And I think that's really interesting. obviously, I think the date is the 18th that this goes into effect. And it's pretty substantial. I mean, that's a huge hike up in price. Especially when you're talking about, to buy a single malt, nowadays it's like $80 to buy something that's worth its weight in water, for God's sake. So what I think we're trying to get to the bottom of is, how is the market going to react to this? Maybe at first they pass it all on, and then they start to realize how damaging it is to their market. Or some people who are really looking to get ahead or build their name up, maybe they're going to be the ones who absorb some of that cost to try and keep their products competitive. Because believe it or not, just like anything else out there, whiskey is something where you have hundreds of brands on the shelves, and somebody is doing everything in their power to make their one label, their one bottle jump out. And you have the uninformed market, which I think is a fairly large portion of the market, and then you have the informed market, which is a smaller but still respectable part of the market. And both of those have to be considered, especially for single malt, because the uninformed market starts to shrink when you get to the single malt range, whereas, the informed market. Yeah, no, I said it right. The uninformed market starts to dwindle in the single malt range, because if you're going to spend that kind of money, you typically want to put a little more time into it. And then vice versa is true. I mean, if you spend less money, you're not going to care as much. You're not going to put as much time or energy into it. So for some of the smaller products, not only is the impact less significant, although it might be equally significant for the people who can afford that bottle, right? If you can't afford the $80 bottle and you can't afford the $20 bottle, and you add $5 to that price, that might be really impactful to you. That might be like, okay, well, I was drinking Johnny Walker Black, and now I'm drinking Cutty Sark. So, there's a lot of dynamics at play here, and it's impossible to tell what's actually going to happen, let alone telling how long it's going to last. But I think everybody in our world wants it to last the least amount of time possible. But just watch out, because, take a note of your pricing, and when you look at it today, typically what happens, and this is coming from somebody who works in supply chain as a profession, when things increase in price, they, if that tariff goes away, they typically don't drop as far as they went up. So you might be buying your Glenfiddich for $55 a day, then it goes up to, I don't know, $65, and it goes down to $58, and you're like, oh, what a deal, because that's how psychology works. But you're not getting a deal. So anyway, I'm home. That's basically the time limit for this video, because I'm trying to make these videos shorter. But let me know your thoughts on the tariff situation, and let me make sure I don't bash my car into the back of my garage. Okay, cheers.